Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Five podcast. Today, I am joined by Logos to discuss the issue of absentee ownership within the context of two current events. Sargon of Akkad's recent legal victory with Aquila and Blizzard's new intellectual property rules. So, Logos, why don't you break these two incidents down for us?
Yeah, no problem. So, what happened earlier in the week was I saw Sargon's Akkad Daily channel, and I saw this video about Aquila, and I'm like, oh, cool, the lawsuit's finally over. He won. How interesting that the court weighed in his favor and decided to say that, just because Aquila posted her content and said she owned her content, they ruled in favor of Sargon on the basis of transformative use. So even if Aquila had the tools, the machinery, and her own speech, Sargon could put it together and make something transformative using 20% of her work. And, I'm always thinking about, political philosophy in the back of my head and some of the screwy things that have been going on for the last 100 and so years. Especially with your recent podcast, you've been talking to Swithin about aggression. You've been talking with Keith Preston and the roundtables about the left and some other things that are going on. I'm just thinking about it. All these things are kind of coming to a head, right? So when a libertarian says, you aggressed against me or my property, you aggressed against my property. Well, what do they mean by that? It's harder to find aggression against property until you know who owns what property, why, and for what reason. And so I'm thinking about the Sargon case. I'm like, yeah, that's really interesting, right? This whole idea that this Lockean idea of labor ownership. Sargon mixed his labor with stuff that Aquila put on the internet, made something interesting to cater to his base, to his market, to reveal a performative contradiction in her view, and the courts allowed it. He mixed his labor with it and made it something his and not hers. And that's going to be really important, a really important distinction that'll come up when we talk about the Blizzard case. So to set up the Blizzard case, this is kind of a more complicated story. Blizzard released Warcraft 3 like a while ago, and there's a custom map on Warcraft 3 called Defense of the Ancients. And the idea was they completely warped the game mode. It was no longer like a base builder, blow up the other person's base like an Age of Empires or StarCraft. But instead it was more of like a new genre of game that would become a MOBA genre. And what happened was some of the people that went to work on that game and others, they moved to Valve, and Valve started making Defense of the Ancients 2 on Steam to compete with League of Legends, which is another spin-off of the game genre. Well, Blizzard, trying to compete with League of Legends, was co-developing this thing with Valve, and Blizzard's like, well, hey, this Defense of the Ancients game was made on our platform, it was our Warcraft game. We want to call our game Defense of the Ancients to compete with Valve or League of Legends. But Valve already had the term copyrighted. I think Dota 2, Defense of the Ancients 2, they had it, and Blizzard's like, we're going to sue you over it. It's our copyright. Well, Blizzard lost. Valve got to keep Dota 2, and so on. Again, what's the pattern here? I think one of the reasons, now I'm not a legal expert, I haven't reviewed this in perfect detail, but I think one of the things that would have been super relevant in the case was that Dota, as it was originally made, was transformative on the work of the Warcraft 3 game. It was a different genre of game, completely unlike. The only thing is they just happened to use Blizzard's assets because it was a custom map, but they made their own expressive game, their own different thing, and so it became a thing with kind of a life of its own that they're making with their own engine and so on now. And so the idea of transformation, these people made Dota by mixing their labor with Blizzard's assets to produce something distinct from what Blizzard themselves had made and intended, made it in some sense their own kind of a game. Well, Blizzard was mad about that. So in recent news, later this week, same week as the Sargon and Aquila thing, we see that people found a new addition to the contract, the EULA thing you sign when you play the game, for the new Warcraft 3 remake that says any custom maps that you make now are the legal and immortal property of Blizzard Entertainment, right? Okay, so Blizzard basically wants to circumvent this Lockean idea of property ownership, the idea that when you mix your labor with something, it becomes in some sense yours because you imprint your labor onto it. It's when you do something to it, you set your mark on it, kind of a thing. And Blizzard says, yeah. We're going to force that. We're going to skip that in the contract and say, we don't want to get sued again. We want to lose the IP again. We don't want to lose in court again, basically. So we're going to force you to say in the contract that even if you mix your labor with a custom map, it's now our custom map because it's our assets. So they want absentee ownership of the thing instead of something they directly produce with their labor. So that kind of sets the stage here between the two conflicting ideas of rights. When do you own something by virtue of you worked and built it and made it your own, and when can you just claim ownership of it because I own the land, I own the assets, I have the title, I was inherited the title, I bought the title, so on and so forth. Well, Blizzard wanted to go really hard on one side of the debate. We made the assets, they're ours, deal with it. Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting and funny, right? So you saw the Quarterings video on this. We talked about this before the stream. Where it gets funny is the Quartering showed some examples of new games by quote unquote Blizzard Entertainment, right? These are Blizzard's games because they're custom maps made on their engine. And I don't even know if, I'd get your channel terminated or whatnot if I mentioned what was in the games live on stream. You can watch the Quarterings video on the topic. They're pretty pretty spicy, to use his lingo. Stuff about, very racial games, anti-Semitic games, about Nazism and things like of that nature. Go check out his video for the descriptions. They're pretty graphic. I'm pretty sure that the kinds of things that could get criminal action against Blizzard in certain European countries, right? I mean, even if these games haven't, somebody could easily make a custom game that just cleverly in the map in French or something in some language just spells out something like the Holocaust never happened. That I know is a criminal offense in many European countries, and they're screwed. Well, Blizzard wants to have their cake and eat it here. Here's the problem. In the old days, under the old contract, it was what was made with Blizzard's engine was kind of the responsibilities of the players, right? So Blizzard would ban them, they delete the maps, but if there was a criminal mischief that could be applied to this thing, Blizzard could say, look, here's the user that made our map, we didn't consent to our tools being used this way, here's their information, go deal with them as your jurisdiction allows, and they'd wash their hands of it, right? But when Blizzard has said anything you make is now legally and morally our property, we own it, it's ours, they have a hard time washing their hands of it anymore, don't they? Because player A makes this map, they mix their labor in with it, they express their political views no matter how distasteful or whatnot, even if Blizzard doesn't like them. Well, if they have this net that says we can take ownership of them, now we have a problem. Well, this seemed to me to be a performative contradiction. This is what happens when you try to use the fruits of the lock-in proviso, but ultimately try to circumvent it with a contract. So that was interesting to me. So the Sargon thing happened, the Blizzard thing happened. You have Sargon winning on the basis of transformative grounds and why we give rights on a transformative basis to people. And this new thing with Blizzard, how they're circumventing it and just getting chewed up for it by the community, playing these interesting tricks. And so I've been having conversations with coworkers about what's going on here because, they're not really into political philosophy and the idea of rights and where they come from and, how do we think of them. And I was able to introduce a whole bunch of concepts to them through these examples. And they kind of got it. They were pretty interested in it. They're going to look it up and so on. So I figured, shoot, me and Todd should talk about this. It should be fun.
Exactly. Now, this is not necessarily a new idea, but it generally helps when you copy someone's material 1,500 years after they're dead. So Romeo and Juliet is sort of a ripoff of Ovid's Primus and Thisbe. But there's a 1,500-year lag there, so no one's going to sue you for that. When it happens in real time, then it's where you get some problems. One of the interesting things was the YouTuber Arch, I forgot his name now, but he was saying that there's no incentive for people to create new content because if they were creating mods for previous Blizzard titles, Arch Warhammer, they're not going to get paid for it now. It's not theirs. They're not even going to get recognized for it. And so Blizzard will just, pick through the best stuff and, use that. And yeah, a lot of people are probably not going to create stuff. Or if they do, they're going to create stuff just to screw people over. So this one guy commenting on Arch Warhammer's channel said, step one, make something inappropriate. Step two, upload it for Reforged. Step three, Blizzard now owns it. Step four, write about it on Facebook. Step five, watch the fireworks. And that is really the problem. And you pointed that out, Lucas. What do you do with that if it's under your property? So yeah, they don't want to be sued by other groups for using their titles. But then they want to have complete control over what their user base creates, which then gets them into liability issues in other ways. Yeah, you can't have your cake and eat it. But you see, the whole point is to avoid liability, right? The whole point of the limited liability corporation was that no one person was liable for damages or for any wrongdoing. And I mean, obviously, if you're liable for something, you have to pay out when things go bad. And I think what you're getting at in part, right, Logos, is this attempt to negate liability for individuals everywhere.
Kind of. I mean, not even on the basis really of liability. It's just something interesting that I noted where it's just in the nature of transformative work, right? It's like Blizzard trying to shoehorn this in with their contract kind of just seems to violate the spirit of the thing. Like, even if it's legally acceptable that when you click yes on this contract, you waive your legal rights to these things. So here's a really good example. When people talk about free speech, right? Here's a really often used one. There's a distinction to be had there between like the legal law of free speech and the spirit of the law of free speech. And so when somebody says like, well, the constitutional amendment about free speech, the Bill of Rights, it just tells you how the government must interact with you as a citizen as far as speech goes. But if a corporation wants to limit your speech, the Constitution says nothing about that. They can do that as a private actor. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is most of the time when people complain about free speech violations or free speech issues, they're thinking about it as an abstract right or principle or a spirit of the thing that's not encoded in any particular legal document, right? So just because something's legally okay doesn't mean violating it won't come up with its host of other issues. Like, so when Jordan Peterson, for example, talks about what happens when you violate, free speech, the spirit of the law, people can't, people are afraid to express certain points of view because they could be censored, at the corporate level, they could lose their jobs, any private punitive actions against them. Well, what do people do when they can't express their beliefs? They pent them up, they join little echo chambers, they join little hidden clubs and keep them to themselves. And, that's how you get revolutions. That's how you get two Americas. That's how you get people not trusting each other. They can't talk things out anymore because they're afraid of punitive action. So when you try to say, well, legally, I can break the spirit of the law and here's how I'm going to do it, you don't absolve yourself of the repercussions that happen when you break the spirit of the law. And this is Blizzard finding that out with the idea of ownership. There's a spirit of the law in terms of ownership, or, your right to property that you worked to build and maintain. You putting something on it that makes the thing yours means that if the property is distasteful, they can say, gross, who made that? Oh, that guy made that. Oh, well, screw him. Okay. But if somebody else gets ownership of this thing I made and they completely circumvent that loop, it's like, well, I make thing X, like gross, who made that X? Oh, well, Blizzard owns it, right? It's Blizzard's. So this is another example where circumventing the spirit of the law, even if it's legally acceptable to do, doesn't absolve you from the reasons the spirit of the law exists.
Exactly. I think one thing that sort of hinges this property dispute is the idea of the Lockean proviso. And Locke's formulation from the Second Treatise of Government, Chapter 5, Paragraph 33 is, nor was this appropriation of any parcel of land by improving it in a prejudice to any other man, since there was still enough and as good left, and more than yet unprovided could use. So that in effect there was nevertheless left for others, because of this enclosure for himself, for that he leaves as much as another can make use of, does as good as nothing at all. Nobody could think himself injured by drinking of another man, though he could take a good draught, and a whole river of the same water left him to quench his thirst. In the case of land and water, where there is enough of both, is perfectly the same. And I think that was one of the key issues that you wanted to get at here. And with the Lockean proviso, if you don't have that, you get a kind of a first dibs, finders keepers, where everybody just gets locked out. Once the biggest, the fastest, the strongest, whoever get there first, they've got it, and then everybody's left out of the process. And so the only people that have rights are the guys that were there first.
Yeah, exactly. And this gets into some really interesting questions. So, for example, the liberals did not really, I don't mean liberals in like the political context of now, you darn liberals. I mean like the classical liberals of like Locke and so forth. They were really railing against aristocracy. They were railing against, land by titled ownership. You should have value, you should have things in virtue of your workmanship, what you do with those things. So the idea that, some king who is divinely ordained could gift this lord a title. So I don't, you don't know the king necessarily. You don't know the lord necessarily. You're living in a house somewhere, and some king you don't know gift to some lord you don't know your land, and now suddenly, like, your house you've been growing stuff and doing stuff is now under the control of somebody that hasn't been working this thing. That's a problem. And so Locke was trying to circumvent this by saying, no. Ownership ought, this is a normative statement, it ought to go to the people who are making use of the land, especially if land is scarce. If land is, fruitful, then it shouldn't matter anyway. Go find your own land and do something cool with it. But if land is scarce, then it really becomes a question, who's making use of what, and should you kick people off? But here's where it gets even more interesting, right? So in the modern economy, you have so you have money as kind of an abstraction of labor. And so the idea is, well, I do some work for somebody and I save up money and I buy land from somebody. Well, technically I did work to buy the land. The money is the result of my work and the money I'm spending with the land. So by proxy, I've done work to get the land. But at the same time, there's some weird things that can happen there where, okay, let's say the Lord, instead of granting a title to nobility of land, let's suppose the Lord just like conquers a place, sets up a bank, prints money, and then whatever the land is quote unquote worth, just gifts the Lord that much money from the bank and says, here's your land. Well, they haven't been gifted a title directly, but they've been gifted money to buy the land. You see what I'm saying? So the money. So on the one hand, you have this tension where money is a proxy for labor, and there's some sense in which it should validly be used to gain ownership of things and so on and so forth. But there's some other sense in which it's kind of like not fair, especially for scarce goods and especially for goods that are, produced of workmanship and so on and so forth. And so while we're getting into this conversation about rights based on this new topic about Sargon and Aquila, and it's kind of like a first world problem, right? Because we're arguing over YouTube produced video content and pixels on computer games. We're not having like Mad Max fights over a river or something like that. But the principles there still go forward. Abstract a little bit our discussion, and you can talk about like industry and manufacturing. Well, person X owns a factory. Well, how'd they get the factory? Did they build it? Well, no, they didn't build it. They had somebody else to build it with money. Oh, well, how'd they get the money? Well, it could be something they worked for and saved up for, but maybe a bunch of really rich investors from Wall Street or banker just loaned them the money, because then they'll use the money to build a factory and then they'll give the money back to the Wall Street people as dividends, right? Well, no work, no mixing of labor took place necessarily in those transactions, unless maybe the Wall Street people, worked for their money, but maybe they inherited it, right? So that's where this conversation gets really, really complicated. And that's where this sets up schisms on the left, schisms on the right, Marxists, left and right libertarians, all these different people. So that's kind of where I'm going with this and why I'm interested in the topic.
Well, okay, let's look at the Kyla Sargon. So basically, he was exonerated because while he used some of the content she created, it was different enough that it fell within the fair use rules, and that he added enough of his own material to it that it wasn't really hers anymore. Now, the classic libertarian position is if you mix your labor with something, you own it. Now, the general thought experiment is assuming that all the land is virgin. But, let's say that you're a sculptor and someone hires you to make a statue. You mixed your labor with the marble, but you don't really own the statue, in part because the contract was implied that you're paid for your work, but you don't own the statue because the guy that hired you owns the marble. But, let's look at a factory. If you make something, obviously the capital investment was the capitalist, but the capital investment on its own, unless it's a robot, isn't going to make anything. And it wouldn't make anything without your contribution. So to what extent is the worker Sargon and the capital stock Kyla?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the real heart of the issue. And it's just such a really interesting thing to think about, because it's kind of like in the middle. So for example, with your previous stream with your libertarian friend, Swithin, I think his name was, you talk about what is aggression. It's like, okay, well, you can aggress against somebody's self, or you can aggress against their property. Well, aggression against a person can be kind of obvious to cash out, except as you pointed out in that stream, in the case of children, where it gets really, really bizarre. But property is even harder than the self. It's like, okay, suppose an artist takes a statue, right? Here's a thought experiment I run. Okay, let's use a statue example again. Let's suppose person A gets marble and pays person B to make them a statue. Okay, now let's suppose person B takes the marble, makes the statue and goes, I like this statue so much, I'm going to run away with it and keep it. They take off with the statue, let's say. Well, let's suppose, the police were tracking this person down, trying to find them, trying to help this person. Let's suppose like aliens take over the earth, like this new alien government takes over, and they want to try to, enforce property rights as best as possible. They don't want to be a culture shock. They want to try to be fair, but maybe they don't have all the records. They don't have any proof. So it's like, okay, so this guy goes to the alien overlord police force and says, hey, this guy has my statue. He tries to explain to the aliens what happened. Well, maybe the aliens with their advanced technology quickly find the guy that run off with the statue, right? They're like, you have this guy's statue. And the guy's like, well, in what sense is it the guy's statue? The aliens are like, what do you mean? Well, I did the marble, I did this. What did the other guy do to make it his statue? And the alien's like, well, that's a good point. Well, maybe the guy has a deed to the marble. Well, if all the records are destroyed, let's say, where's the guy's deed to the marble? Well, I don't know. Where's his deed to the marble, right? And so, like, the way these thought experiments go that get really interesting to me is we can, on one hand, have like some record of titles, but you could have records of titles for like nobility owning lands too. But when you have like money buying deeds and then deeds changing hands, people sell lands to each other and so on and so forth. But you have like, say, workers working the land as the land changes hands and so on and so forth. Well, if an alien fleet came down and took over the world or something, and you looked at this, if the records are gone, or maybe the aliens just wouldn't have any interest in titles anyway. They're like, what good are titles to us? We have like no legal or metaphysical like ought behind these titles. What the hell are these? We're gonna look at the land and figure out like who's doing what with the land. If they say, hey, these people have been living here for 20 years, what are you doing? We'll just let them have it. It's like, that's where the thing gets interesting.
Well, I mean, you are talking about a sort of interesting thought experiment, but in some sense it already happened. When the Europeans settled the New World, the Native Americans had a concept of property use and ownership that was radically different from the Europeans. And the Europeans are like, well, we don't recognize yours. And the Native Americans were like, we don't recognize yours. And of course, they ended up fighting over the land because nobody recognized the other's property claims. But, so for example, when libertarians like Murray Rothbard said, well, look, if Native Americans could prove ownership, but you see, they didn't believe in title or deed. So how could a Native American meaningfully prove property ownership to the satisfaction of a libertarian? They couldn't. The only way they could prove it was by occupancy and use, which libertarians ipso facto reject.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's what gets you to these really, really weird places.
But hold on a second. The problem here, though, with occupancy and use, and I don't want to rag on absentee landlords too much here, is in the stream that I did with Brenton Lengo a couple of years ago. I said, look, let's say you have two houses, one in Maine, one in Florida, summer house in Maine and a winter house in Florida. No, you're technically not occupying the winter house in Maine when you're in Florida, but you're still there. You still own it, rather, and you still live there half the year. Like, do you really lose control of it? It's not like a factory that's been abandoned for 20 years and now we got to figure out what to do with it. I mean, it's not abandoned per se, but you're not using it. And for things that I own, like books, clothes, junk, I mean, I don't use it all the time. I mean, how often do I have to use it for it to be mine? Once a year, once a lifetime? I mean, it gets really tricky who owns what with an occupancy and rules use setup. And apparently the Native Americans didn't figure that out either because they fought over hunting grounds an awful lot.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because that's one of the places I was eventually going to transition into. You could say a lot of these thought experiments, a lot of these things that are coming up in the news are cases against, absentee ownership going too far. Here's some things that you don't want to happen to you might happen to you. When I own everything everybody does, I might get more than I bargained for. But you can also go too far in the other direction as well. It's just like I think that the libertarians and the capitalists do have some kind of a point where, let's suppose you do work and you do put some life savings into getting a factory together and getting some machines together. It's like the model they offer isn't completely unreasonable, where you get all this stuff together and you say, look, I got this factory. I'm going to start building these widgets. They're super popular. I want to get some people together to help me run these machines. We'll all be better off than we were, because what were you doing before? You could have been doing nothing. Who knows? The enclosure acts and stuff like that, notwithstanding. I mean, that's one of the other reasons this topic is so interesting. All these people living on land, they're kicked off by the nobility and sold to the capitalists and whatever. That's like a really nasty, thorny topic. But in a vacuum, right? In a vacuum, absent these previous systems where these people are, landless, homeless, they can't provide for themselves and so on. Let's suppose, these people just had nothing better to do. We'll give some charity here. These people have nothing better to do. And this person saves up a bunch of money, gets his factory, and says, okay, let's help me build some stuff. I'll pay you. You weren't going to do anything anyway. I'll pay you. You'll have more money than you had. You help me build stuff. People get stuff they want. We all get money. We're all happy. Kumbaya. It's great. And I think there's really kind of something to that model, where even if you can't occupy and use every part of the factory, your vision kind of built it, your money, your time, your effort, something of yours did go into kind of making it, even if it's not completely your labor that's running the thing in the day-to-day operation. And so it would be kind of bizarre where, let's say you build a factory and you're working along with your workers, but let's say you get sick and go to the hospital for like a week or a month or something like that, something unavoidable. You come back and the worker's just like, yeah, you weren't here working it, so it's our factory now. Later, all the work you did building it, setting it up, logistics, everything, it's all worthless. You're not occupying it for some length of time, which could be arbitrary. How do you decide, as you pointed out? And then boom, your factory is gone. So I do think you're right. It's fair to point out that you could also go too far in the other direction with occupancy and use. So finding the balance is a really interesting topic.
Well, here's to go out on a limb here. The occupancy and use is the classic socialist definition of legitimate property ownership on a spectrum from anarchists to even state socialists. And then on the, for lack of a better word, the modern right, the capitalist side, you have what we just talked about, the absentee landlordship style of ownership. But what's interesting is both of these political theories are not based in observed human behavior and reality, but abstract axiomatic principles of what people are and how they ought to behave. And I think what we're getting at here is that people don't really, they kind of fit, but they kind of don't. And when they kind of don't fit, we get these really weird things happening.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
The other thing is, we have an answer, sort of, for this. The sort of pre-capitalist, pre-socialist, conservative. Now, again, I don't want to say that there's just one position. If you look at property norms in the Old Testament, property norms in ancient Athens, property norms in ancient Rome, they're all going to be very different. But what made those property norms work was they were an organic expression of a society's culture. And because everybody agreed on it and it worked to solve realistic disputes they were dealing with, they were used until they broke down. So in the Roman system, right, it breaks down with from the sort of homestead yeoman farmer property arrangements to the latifundias, which then break down into feudal manors. And so, but the fact is, at least none of these property norms, except maybe ones that claim to be inspired by divine revelation, like the Old Testament, are independent of human experience in the sense that, you imagine an abstract set of conditions and then work out from it. These are property norms that were developed by people to deal with real world issues based on how they observed other people acting, which is why I think they were more useful and relevant for the time that they were.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. What you described there sounded just like, a rant that Thorstein Veblen would have went on. Economics, you would say, is not some abstract necessary properties of human beings that we set up like a thermodynamics equation, find an equilibrium, and there's an answer. Or, abstract how humans ought to be and base rights and things based off of that. He famously said, economics, it should study the life history of a culture of people. And so property rights as an extension of that should be, how did people solve disputes? So I was reading in The Theory of Business Enterprise, chapter 4, where he noted that the old ways of dealing with property and ownership really emphasized livelihood and place. So the idea here is property wasn't just something that people own to derive profit from, like in our current thing, but property was an extension of you, what you do for your community, what you do to survive, what you do for a living. And so property is kind of like a personal expression of your standing in the community to some degree or another. And so in that way, if you have this livelihood conception, this idea of, buy as much as you can and use it for profit would be just kind of like alien to a culture like that. But it does solve some really interesting disputes. Yeah, so there was something I wanted to bring up, but I forgot. What do you have to say about that for the moment while I remember?
Well, it sounds like Veblen would fit into the historicist school, which would include Weber,
Definitely.
and the likes. Yeah, it's the only school that makes sense. And the reason why it's the only school that makes sense is let's play a little dictionary definition game that people love to play. The etymological root of economics is the two Greek words oikos, which means house, and nomos, which means law, and it means household law or how to manage a house. Now, notice with these two political extremes, one is radical individualism, which is libertarianism, and then one is radical collectivism, which is socialism, neither of which are a household. So the proper way to contextualize economic action is not the collective or the individual, but the household. And we know this to be true because it's in the definition of the concept. And economics more or less worked as long as that was understood.
Yeah, thank you for going into the oikos nomos definition, because that reminded me the next place I wanted to go with this was Aristotle. It's a really good example of the livelihood model of economics. I think we were talking a while ago, and we were talking about how in the politics, I think it was the politics, Aristotle was talking about how people should have a tract of land that they can live on and use for self-sustaining, right? Voting people should own property. And citizens in general should have property that they can use to sustain themselves. And, we were talking about this privately a while ago, and some good reasons for this, just off the bat, if you don't have property that's arable, that you can use to grow your own food and kind of live in times of hardship, you are kind of dependent in a way on your employer for day-to-day sustenance. You're dependent on a landlord, let's say, for a roof over your head, a corporation for your job. You don't really own anything you can fall back on. And so what happens? So what happens if, let's say, your landlord raises your rent and your wages aren't keeping up? You can't give your boss give you a raise. You can't get your break, right? Well, your livelihood in the classical definition, like your survival, it's at stake. So what do? If you can't appeal to the two properties you're appealing to day to day to live, you kind of have to go over their heads and appeal to the government, right? You have to appeal to one force that can say, listen, you're going to have to treat this guy fairly. You're either going to have to up his wages or lower his rents, rent control, increase the minimum wage, something. And we'll have to balance the economy by fiat, because what happens if the government does nothing? You have a whole bunch of people that can't afford to live, can't afford to eat. You get revolutions in the streets. So that's where I was going with that one. What do you think about that?
Totally agree. There's this great quote from C.S. Lewis where he says, I believe a man is happier and happy in a richer way if he has the freeborn mind. But I doubt whether he can have this without economic independence, which the new society is abolishing. For economic independence allows an education not controlled by government, and in adult life, it is the man who needs and asks nothing of government, who can criticize its acts and snap his fingers at its ideology. Read Montaigne. That's the voice of a man with his legs under his own table, eating the mutton and turnips raised on his own land. Who will talk like that when the state is everyone's schoolmaster and employer? Now, that could equally be said of megacorps. That's absolutely correct, because we see that nobody is willing to stick their neck out and tell the truth about what's going on because they can't afford to. They could get fired. They're so indebted if they don't pay the bills. And as you pointed out, the cost of living with rents and food and energy consumption are so high that even if you didn't have debts, you'd have to get into debts to pay for that. And so you can't afford to get fired. And so self-sufficient. But again, this is what America was supposed to be. You read the founding fathers, you read the political theorists in early American Republic, Jefferson most famously. And the whole point was to have a sort of yeoman stock for this country to maintain a sort of independence and liberty. Now, this was the section that I sent to you on Facebook, but a friend of mine photocopied a segment of a book of American history. And I think this is sort of like the median between absentee ownership and right to use. And it's describing the New England Puritans. Diligent and realistic, most New England families sought an independent competency. Independence meant owning enough property, a farm or a shop to employ a family without having to work for someone else as a hired hand or servant. A competency meant sufficiency, but not an abundance of worldly goods, enough to eat, adequate if simple clothing, a roof over their heads, some consumer goods, and the ability to transmit this standard of living to many children. Although no land of riches, New England provided many independent farms and secured household competency to hard and persistent labor. Edward Johnson of Massachusetts noted that even the poorest person hath a house and a land of his own, and bread of his own growing, if not some cattle. Puritans regarded such a broad-based prosperity as more compatible with godly life than the extreme of wealth and poverty found in England, the Chesapeake, and the West Indies. The Puritan minister John White observed, "Nothing sorts better with piety than competency." And I really think this is what, when a lot of Americans complain about the extremes of wealth and poverty in America today, and they think about a good old times or the good old days, that is exactly what they're talking about. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And one other thing to bring up too about this mean, let's abstract it a little bit, because you can think of it in terms of use only what you need. Use, you can have religious principles to dictate, some type of modesty. Don't be gaudy, don't show off, don't, whatever. But I think if we abstract a little further, we could just get to an older notion of obligations, especially in, say, the medieval idea of property ownership. So the idea is you want to get property in a community, and the property is scarce. And so there's this tacit understanding where there's some zero-sum game going under the hood where you own property that other people could own. And so to do that, we're going to integrate you into the community as a property owner. You're not just some atomized individual who happens to own a strip of land in, New England or something. By owning that land, you are a New Englander, and you should do as the New Englanders do. You should, contribute to the community. With your land comes some sort of responsibility to those around you. And I think that's another really, really important piece as far as the median goes. It's not just about who has a right to what, as the right often says, but I don't know how much they believe it in this day and age. Rights often come with obligations. It's like, okay, you have the right to land ownership. We want you to use it to sustain yourself and your family, but we don't want you gobbling up all the land. We don't want you to be a slumlord. We want you to do proper things with the land to make the community a better place.
Exactly. And this is, I think, another segue that we've talked about a lot, is that rights are a superstitious construct. They can't be proven empirically, and they cannot be derived from first principles. So a lot of this problem of property distribution has to do with the concept of rights itself. If we have a concept of duties and obligations, so for example, the late Roger Scruton pointed out in What It Is to Be a Conservative, that conservatives believe we are all born into an interlocking web of obligations that we have to live up to. And if we all live up to it, then society more or less works properly. So if you think that if you're owed rights, there's a disincentive for you to do anything, because you're owed them merely for existing, merely for breathing. You just breathe air, so you get these rights. So you have no incentive to maintain the infrastructure, both of human and physical capital, that ensures that you have these rights. Whereas if you have a system of interlocking obligations, in the case of C.S. Lewis, in the case of the Puritans, it's going to be Christianity, then you can maintain this kind of broad-based support for people. As the guy in the book said, even the poorest New Englander had his own house and could feed his own family. So he didn't live like a king, but he wasn't a pauper either.
Exactly. And another good thing I want to point out here is this idea of a supporting network of obligations, right? Because you can kind of hear the libertarians' objections from here a mile away about what we just talked about, right? This idea that, well, how dare you expect anything of me? I'm an individual. I produce what I produce. I have my own land. Who are you to intrude upon that? Tell me I ought to do anything with my land. There's no objective fact of the matter about moral oughts. It's all subjective. I have my own personal utility function. Leave me alone, kind of a deal, right? But here's the point, and I'm gonna harken back to an oldie but goodie. Remember when you talked with what was it, Bob Murphy? I think it was about national defense.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So harken back to that idea, right? Your community might be attacked. So these older ideas of rights didn't just protect the community from you, but they could also protect you collectively from outside people that would attack the community. So back in the old days, when these obligations constructs were a thing, I mean, think about the Middle Ages. It was crazy. You had the Vikings, you had the Huns, you had all sorts of crazy nonsense, attack. You had, attacks from, the East, Muslims occupying Spain, so on and so forth. Like, your life was absolutely insane. But you have this idea where it's like, you take care of me and I'll take care of you. In the New England context, it's like, well, suppose, Britain invades the War of 1812, wants to take stuff for England or something, right? It's like, well, we could be in this individually, or we could be in this together. If you follow your rules as New Englander, we're all good with each other, we're all good with the community, right? If your land gets attacked first by the British, we'll fight and die to help preserve your land. You are one of us because you're using your land, your labor, you're behaving as one of our community. We'll fight together as a community, even if it's your stuff being attacked or my stuff being attacked and so on. So that's one example in which these obligations aren't just some negative, you can't do X nanny statism, but they're actually like a means to support stuff. Here's a good modern day contrast to this. There are huge swaths of land, like in Canada or something, that are owned by China. There's land in Seattle, there's land in Canada. China's buying up tracts of land all over the US, right? Let's suppose in some hypothetical world, this is probably not going to happen, but just bear with me. Let's suppose we get invaded by like Mexico, and Mexico attacks these cities and says, well, we're going to take this land. Well, okay, if China buys these tracts of land, and China is, rents are going up and things are awful, they're not really doing much with the land, they're just speculating on it, so it makes it hard for the people to live. Okay, suppose Mexico starts marching through Seattle or something, and they start attacking this land that China owns. Do you think that anybody's going to bend over backwards to defend China's assets from these invaders if they're attacked?
No.
Of course not. Why would they? What's the purpose? Them owning it makes my life more expensive. I have little enough as it is. I'll defend my stuff. China can fend for itself. Worst case scenario, we repel China, the land's in ruins, China washes its hands of it anyway, and rents go down because people can build new houses, or you do something useful with it. Their ownership of the land isn't impacting me negatively because they're washing their hands of it. And so now we can integrate it into our community and do something useful to all of us with it. So this idea of interlocking obligations, it has foreshadows in the present with absentee ownership, like internationally with globalism, but also in the old days with just like, suppose your land gets attacked before my land. I'll fight to help you, you fight to help me.
Yeah. One of the main arguments against absentee ownership and why we need a Lockean proviso is sort of best illustrated in Latin America. When the Spanish, well, let's be honest, even before the Spanish conquest, these arrangements existed. The Inca Empire, everything was owned by the state. The Inca Empire was in many ways proto-tanky. Everything was owned by the state and there was no money. The Aztecs, I think, had money and property, but it was owned by the nobility and the king. And with the encomiendas and the haciendas, a tiny handful of people owned most of the usable land. And the standard of living to which they were accustomed at living only needed a fraction of that land to be worked to profit from. Well, let's say it takes 10% of the land that they own to maintain their opulent lifestyle. Well, the other 90% is just not going to get used. And there's still people that need to eat. There's still people that need to grow food and build houses. And if they try to do that, they'll be kicked off as squatters. Well, the left-wing argument is that the land isn't used efficiently. And up to a point, they're right. It happened in Russia, it happened in China. This land wasn't being used efficiently. Now, the libertarians will say, but Mr. Capitalist will have these vast tracts of land and will farm it or develop it and make it into something useful. Now, they might be using it, in the way that an aristocratic landlord wasn't. But that just begs the question, is it useful development, and useful for who? I mean, when you bulldoze a bunch of shanty huts to build a strip mall, it might be good for the investors, but it's not good for the people who lost their homes. So even if you can argue that more than 10% of the land is getting used by the landlord, who is directly benefiting it? And again, this gets back to the Enclosure Acts, right? They were kicked off the land to grow cash crops or to grow sheep or whatever. And so this is where I think the solution to occupancy and use and to absentee landlords is something like what I just mentioned with the Puritans and C.S. Lewis, which is, of course, rooted in the Old Testament when Joshua divvies up the land in Canaan. It's basically under the larger families get more land and smaller families get less. The land is there to ensure independent, autonomous families. And I think if you do that, you don't necessarily have great amounts of wealth and you don't have a lot of opulence, true, but you also don't have people running around naked, starving in the street either.
Exactly. And you do have a sense of community in which, people feel like they're treated fairly and getting taken care of by people around them. We've talked about current political events. Other videos have brought this up all the time. In fact, Tucker Carlson just brought this up recently on his show. So this is fairly mainstream. This is no longer just like, us fringe quacks on YouTube, so to speak, talking about this. The idea that when you have people, especially young men and to an extent women, but mostly young men, who feel pressured out. They can't seem to find property. They can't seem to find work. They can't seem to support themselves, have families, have kids. The system's kind of abandoned them. As Sargon likes to say on his channel, the African proverb, a child shunned by the village, or you could even say a young man shunned by the village, will burn it down to feel its warmth. Well, the principle just applies. So you have all these people, the right complains, oh, Bernie Sanders, he's so awful, he's a socialist. It's like, well, look at young kids today, as Tucker's, advising everybody to do. I think Tucker, to some extent, has this idea in the back of his head. He talks about aristocratic obligations all the time. But you just look at this, it's like, you have massive student loan debt for a lot of these kids. You have insane rents for a lot of these kids. All the jobs seem to be going to the cities for the most part. Well, to move to cities to get these jobs, you pay high rents. So you're kind of like spinning a hamster wheel, barely getting ahead. You have some people retiring still with massive student loan debts and so on and so forth. At the one hand, you could say, well, bootstraps and it's your problem, you deal with it yourself, and so on and so on and so forth. But if the response to, hey, here's problems I'm dealing with, and here's systematic problems that a lot of other people are going to be dealing with, was, well, this is something you deal with as individuals individually, then don't be surprised if a revolutionary candidate turns up and says, well, look, we'll make some systematic solution to solve your problems. We'll treat you like a community. We'll treat you like human beings. You won't be left to fend for yourselves. And it could be a socialist. It could be a fascist. It could be all sorts of other things. But, if the candidate meets these people's needs, there you go. As Tucker said, the candidate that helps, what do you say, that helps millennial 30-somethings get homes and stable living arrangements and have kids, that's the kind of candidate that's going to win. Even if the millennials only think they'll do that, but they're wrong. And that's
populist right. That's why it's going to be the populist right.
Exactly right. It's a populist left, populist right. And Tucker says that's a candidate that'll deserve to win. So this idea of obligations, this abstract, difference between rights, it actually matters for current political discourse, for all this stuff.
Well, directly related to this, did you watch that triggering video I sent you from AIER? Have two-income households made us poorer?
No, I hadn't got around to watching that one yet, but I have a good idea of what they'll say on the matter.
Yeah, it's pretty triggering. It's like, well, look, the reason why we eat fast food, Logos, is it's just more efficient than home cooked meals, bro.
It is.
No, but yeah. But I think now again, theocratic systems are a bit interesting, right? So Roman property rights was essentially purely empirical, purely practical. The Romans just worked it out. Whereas you can look at the Hebrews or the Muslims, and it's sort of like dropped down from on high. Now, was it a axiomatic first principles, like, say, libertarianism or socialism? Not really. But it is similar in the sense that it's it's a priori. It's not from physical experience per se, because Moses or Muhammad say they got it from a divine agent. Whatever you want to say about that, it is interesting that the property arrangements that the Bible advocates, and that to the extent they were copied by Western Europeans, have led to the best results and avoided a lot of these really weird problems.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. We should analyze the principles and figure out, what it is that made them tick, what made them so long lasting. The Jubilee, we talk about the Jubilee all the time in the series about economics. We talked about the Jubilee, forgiving debts. It's like maybe it's not the most economically efficient thing to do to forgive debts, but there is something to be said. If you have a huge chunk of your community that's really burdened by this thing, and it's fraying social stability, it's causing resentment, it's causing these things. It's like, okay, would we be willing to give up some money and some financial loss to make sure that we're stronger together as a community? We got each other's backs. We'll deal with each other if we're attacked, and so on and so forth. Those are kinds of things that these theocratic systems can do. It's like, look, even if empirically you think that the best thing for you to do is X, maybe there's some reason you haven't thought of that you should do Y. The priest is going to tell you, and you're just going to do it. The only weakness I can see in theocratic systems is if it's abused because it's a priori and you can't really resolve this empirically if there's a dispute. If a priest were to abuse a particular law, it's really hard to appeal the abuse and say, well, the way you're appealing to it isn't quite working out. That's the only problem I can really think of the systems.
Well, it's interesting. I do think you could make an empirical case for forgiving debts. There was a folk tale told in China during one of the periods of imperial collapse, where a local petty king hires a wandering madman for his court, and he asks the wandering madman, "What is the secret to happiness?" To making, and he says, "Well, look, you send me to all your outlying districts, and I'll tell you." So he goes to the city that has the most debt to the king, and he forgives all of it. And the king's like, "Are you crazy? You just lost me a ton of money." And the wandering fool's like, no, trust me, it's going to work out. So 10 years later, he's overthrown in a palace coup. He has nowhere to go. And he says to the wandering madman, "Where do we go?" And he's like, that city that we forgave all the debts? I hear they'll put you up for a while. And when he finally shows up and he's got a place to stay, he realizes the wisdom of the wandering fool.
Yeah, I think that goes to the point I was trying to make perfectly. When I said empirically, even if you don't see an empirical solution, you're like the king saying, "Why are you doing this? Look at all this money I'm missing. If they pay back their debts, if I keep growing this money, I get all this money back in 10 years, right?" So there's like a raw physical, like tangible value of financial assets that people often appeal to as the efficient outcome. But what the wise madman, paradoxically enough, said was, it's not about the money sometimes. Sometimes you want to have a community relation to fall back on. Being in this together can be more powerful. It's kind of like a financial intangible. This is another thing that, Austrians and Veblen and other people have, criticized economics for, is they try to take utility functions and to some degree boil them down to money and costs and things like that. You can find the utility value of a dollar and whatever. But there are some intangibles that I just don't think nicely map to financial comparisons in the way that they try to do. So it's like, what is the price that king would have paid on having somewhere to go if he had a palace coup? Well, he'd have to calculate the probability he thought a palace coup might happen and do all these weird calculations. It doesn't matter at the end of the day. You don't put a financial price on that sort of thing. It's just the kind of thing you do with your citizens just in case, and just because they're human beings, and just because like you're a community together, that kind of makes things work out. Like if you boil everything down to these financial probabilities and utility curves, and people calculate wrong, nations suffer. I'm thinking about like Rome, where the aristocrats kind of took the yeoman farmers' land while they were off marching in the wars, and all the instability that caused. It's like, well, yeah, look at all the money we get from this, and I'm sure we'll export more goods, they'll make the economy more efficient, and blah blah blah. And what's the worst that can go wrong? And then Caesar comes into power, saying, "Yeah, I'll take care of all you people that were downtrodden by the system." And all these senator aristocrats lost a whole lot of power because they screwed the people over. The people screwed them over by bringing a Caesar into power, and so on and so forth.
Exactly. We're nearing the end of the hour. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
No, I guess my last word on the matter is look how interesting it is that we talked about these kind of mundane, banal, events, just legal cases about pixels on the internet, YouTube videos, and video games. And very quickly, you start asking questions, lead to more questions, which lead to more questions, which, lead to these really interesting classical versus modern insights about obligations and rights and so on, with really rich discussions about history and culture and what makes humans humans. So I guess the thing I'd leave people with if they're watching is use the mundane to always try to bring people into a discussion about history and the extraordinary and the abstract and what makes us us. You'll never know who it might resonate with. So always look for opportunities to make those kind of connections.
All right. Thank you again, Logos. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.